Hi folks, tonight we're going to take a look at an overview of To Kill a Mockingbird, specifically looking at what were the major themes and motifs that Harper Lee put into the novel. And just a reminder, the definition of a theme in a novel is the fundamental and universal ideas that get explored. Basically, you ask yourself, what did the main character learn? And whatever the main character learned, that's probably what the author wants you to also learn to think about as well. So looking back over the story, we see obviously lots of themes of racial prejudice. We see all kinds of ideas about different types of courage, the idea of how you break down prejudice through personal individual relationships, this strong need to understand someone else's point of view, to walk a mile in their shoes. And finally, the idea of growing up, role models, morality, how do children become adults in the world? The first thing to remember about To Kill a Mockingbird is that it's a coming-of-age story. It's told from about a little girl who grows up, and we see her start the novel as an adult, kind of looking back on her whole life. Now, this is similar to other coming-of-age stories that you find in literature. If you remember back last fall, we looked at Telemachus and the Odyssey and the things he has to go through to move from childhood into adulthood. Coming-of-age stories are often told as a frame where you start as the adult and then you come back to the adult point of view at the end, or is just a flashback entirely. Usually the character, the child, goes through some sort of conflict or becomes isolated from their parents or their support group in some way. This leads to changes in maturity, and usually there's a loss of innocence, but a gain in wisdom and experience. Now, a motif, remember from our spoonful definitions, is a pattern that's repeated in a story or novel or a piece of literature, and this pattern often becomes a symbol, and these symbols and motifs will usually support the theme. So some of the motifs that we see in the story have to do with poverty, and we're set up with two very different kinds of poor white families in the story. The first are the Cunninghams, and they represent the kind of characters that you find throughout the Depression. These are the hardworking Americans who want to do their very best. They're honest, they're proud, they don't want to accept handouts. They're willing to give up an awful lot to not have to take a handout from other people, but just the circumstances of the times between the Depression, the droughts, and the farming issues, they're not able to make it so much on their own. And these are the people who always pay back their debts, even if, as we saw with the Cunninghams, it's with hickory nuts or turnips or just holly that they've cut. And that's contrasted with the Ewells, who represent what's known as poor white trash in the novel. These people might be in the same situation as the Cunninghams, but rather than approaching it with as much hard work and honesty as they can, they use this as an excuse to do nothing, to look for handouts wherever they can. The Ewells are foul-mouthed. The expression is they've never done a day's work. They're good for nothing. They're offered the opportunity to have an education, and they refuse it every year. We see this idea of the immorality, the drunken father who can't raise the children. So you have this contrast between these two very different types of poverty. Another motif you'll see throughout the story are the style choices that the author makes with language. Scout sometimes uses a child's voice and little kinds of kids' phrases, but other times she sounds very much like the adult, even when she's not in that flashback or that frame situation. Atticus almost inevitably uses formal speech, and even the children use a formal name when they speak to him. There's no dad or daddy involved. Calpurnia is able to switch back and forth. When she's in the Finch's household, she speaks in the white dialect, but then she can code switch back to the Southern Black dialect when she's back among the Black families and her own household and church. The Ewells are constantly using foul words and obscenities just to underscore again their dirtiness and their evilness. Jem, Scout, and Dill use a ton of slang and represent that sort of childhood part of the language. And then you see things like Tom Robinson shown in the phonetic dialect, where we don't see this throughout the rest of the book, emphasizing the words that he will substitute. And this kind of serves to underscore just how separated he is from the white jurors, the white judges, the white trial lawyers in that attorneys in that trial. And then finally, you'll see all different kinds of words that are used for Black that are very typical of that time. Now, Harper Lee certainly could have made her novel cleaner in terms of the terms that she uses, but it wouldn't have been in sync with the time. It would have seemed very unnatural. Instead, she chooses to use the phrases, even though they might be offensive, because they represent the way people really talk and to show you the reality of that particular time. Probably the number one motif in the story that becomes the most powerful symbol is that of the mockingbird. And the mockingbird symbolizes this idea of something completely innocent that only adds good to the world, that it would be a sin to go out into damage. And there's two different strong candidates for who the mockingbird is. One is Tom Robinson, who's the central part of that particular subplot, who's obviously an innocent in every possible way that we can think of, a hardworking man, married, tries to help other people, and ends up just completely and totally destroyed by the racism and the hatred. And the other one is Boo Radley, who would be destroyed by all of the things that would happen if it became known that he was involved with the struggle with the Ewells, and the way that the kids try to villainize him instead. But really all he is just a very shy, very quiet man who's just been out there kind of helping them all along. Now, you could also look at the children themselves as an example of who could be the mockingbirds. Both Jem and Scout, and Dill to a lesser extent, are very innocent at the beginning of the book. They're simple children, but as the novel moves on, they have to face all of the nastiness that's out there in the world and have to encounter it directly in their family. And this changes them and they become more mature. So even though there's a good that comes out of it, their very childhood innocence is killed by the sins of the racism and the hatred in the town. So in some ways, they also could be the mockingbirds. Another interesting way to think about the symbols in the book are to look at the names for people. One of the most important things that anyone does in life is to name their children. And when authors write stories and they pick names for their characters, they pick them very deliberately. So we see things with Harper Lee here with Scout, for example, even though that's a nickname. Obviously, what does a scout do? They're the first people to go out. They're looking for new areas. They're trying to go out there and find new experiences. Then you get to Atticus, and Atticus actually refers to a very famous lawyer who was from the district Attica of ancient Greece and symbolizes again that kind of balance of justice and wisdom. Atticus is also connected with the Stoics, which was a particular philosophy of life that had to do with temperance, with not giving into your emotions, but with living with wisdom, justice, courage, and with balance in your life. And you see that very much symbolized in the kind of father, the kind of man, the kind of lawyer that Atticus is. Even some of the minor character names in the book can become symbolic. Calpurnia seems like an interesting name. That's not a name you hear every day. And there's a specific reason why, again, the author would have chosen that. Calpurnia was known as the wife of Julius Caesar, and she was known for staying faithful to Caesar right through the very end and for having no children of her own. And you can see the obvious tie-ins to Calpurnia with her faithfulness to Atticus Finch, to the household, and with giving up not necessarily her own children, but with having her primary care being for Jem and Scout, who are not her own children. Ewell, you may not have thought of, but it's actually an old English spelling of the word evil. The original spelling of E-V-I-L, or evil, meaning nastiness and badness and horrible, terrible, awful things, was actually spelled with a W in the original forms of English, if you go back to ancient English, Old English, and Middle English language. You look at Dill, which again is another odd kind of nickname. Now, Dill is supposedly based on a real friend that the author Harper Lee had when she was growing up, who was Truman Capote, who grew up to be a famous author in his own right. Probably his most famous novel was something called In Cold Blood. But dill itself is a seasoning. It's often used in pickles. It's a very small flower that has a very spicy scent. And you see dill has kind of that same sort of character. He's described as being very small, and he kind of adds a little spice to their summers there. And even things like Arthur Boo Radley. Boo obviously is something that we associate with ghosts, so the ghosts come out and scare you, boo. But Arthur is also most famously connected with King Arthur, the legendary hero who saved his kingdom the same way that Arthur, in this case Radley, is able to save the children from Bob Ewell. Now, we already did kind of a deep dive into this chapter 10 and Tim Johnson, but it's worth looking at again. Tim Johnson is the rabid dog, and that entire chapter, that dog represents prejudice. Prejudice being a disease that causes a kind of madness in people's heads. There is no rational reason to be prejudiced against another person, but it spreads and it causes a lot of damage, and it's very hard to treat or to get rid of. And it shows that general kind of insanity or madness that's going to come come over this whole town throughout Tom Robinson's trial. And just as Atticus Finch is our lawyer, our symbol for justice, the one who decides to defend the innocent man, he is also old one-shot Finch there, the only person with good enough aim to solve the problem. The sheriff can't solve it, which means the laws are by themselves are not going to be able to solve prejudice, but Atticus, with his combination of compassion and justice, knows exactly how to aim this at the town to do the best job of possibly getting rid of this disease. There are tons of other symbols and small events that really have some deeper meanings throughout the whole book. You could look at the snowman that Jem and Scout make, for example, and the way that it starts off all pure and white and then it becomes sort of dirty and dusty as it falls apart to show, again, this blending, this mix of good and evil in the town. Miss Maudie's house burning down is not a random event. It also symbolizes the kind of chaos and uncertainty that's going to happen and the way that Miss Maudie's going to have to move in together and learn to get along with other people the same way that the town is eventually going to have to learn to get together with each other, or else they're not going to be able to survive also. So that fire becomes symbolic of something very damaging, very upsetting that can eventually shows the conflicts that the community is going to have to deal with. The Gray Ghost comic books that the kids are always reading. It's pretty obviously a symbol here for Boo Radley. He's even described as the face was as white as his hands and his gray eyes were so colorless. But it also symbolizes this general idea of heroism and heroic acts. The superhero, the good guy who's going to have to ride in and get something done in the town, but who isn't going to necessarily be seen or appreciated. One motif that some students actually become kind of frustrated by is this constant reference to social class. Who is your family? To whom are you related? And all of these people that seem so narrowly chunked in together just based on their family. And this is this idea that the whole town kind of breaks down this way, and that your connections become your destiny. That in this particular society, in the world of Maycomb, your place is shaped by the externals, by what you look like and who you're connected to, who your family is, rather than your internals. And it's very hard to break that down. So one Cunningham represents all of the Cunninghams. One Ewell represents all of the Ewells. And the entire black community becomes represented by people like Calpurnia and Tom Robinson. And you see this hardworking, but even though they may be hardworking and honest, they're still regarded as lower than even the worst of the white people underneath this social class system that Maycomb has set up. The author spends a lot of time telling us about Scout not being like a girl that you would expect. There was this Southern definition of femininity that had to do with wearing the frilly dresses and, sipping the tea in just a certain way and always saying yes, ma'am, and being so incredibly polite and dainty. Whereas Scout is considered a tomboy because she doesn't necessarily embrace those girly kinds of things, but instead is out there getting dirty, ready to fight, ready to take on the hard things. And we see all these different kind of influences on Scout's femininity. Look at all the female role models in her life in the absence of her own mother. We see Miss Maudie, we see Calpurnia, and these are two ladies that are very much a part of her day-to-day life that both show very strong hearts and good understanding. Then we see the opposite with Mayella Ewell and even Mrs. DeBose really showing the worst side of women and kind of breaking Scout's innocence on what a lady should be like when they grow up. And finally, you have characters like Aunt Alexandra, who represents the old South, the proper way of doing things, the remember who you are, young lady type. She's always trying to change Scout, always trying to get her into a dress, always trying to get her to behave. But what's interesting to note is at the end of the novel, Aunt Alexandra is the one that's actually starting to change her ways and her behavior. So Scout really is having more of an influence on her than the other way around. In addition to the obvious references to black and white and the prejudicial and racial issues of the story, what the book is actually getting to is this idea that the coexistence of black and white also coincides with this idea that we're going to have a coexistence of good and evil, that no single person, like we saw in the Shakespearean characters, is going to be all good or all bad. Now, Scout and Jem learn this through their experiences as they go through. Atticus is really the one person that kind of represents the balance between the two. And if you think about it, Atticus Atticus is a lawyer who represents the laws and the courts, and the symbol of the courts is, of course, that scale of justice. That you can't judge other people, you don't know what's going on inside of them, you can't see the world from their point of view. We see this with even things like the sheriff, who is supposed to keep the law, is willing to cover up the story at the end in order to protect Boo. We see Boo Radley himself, who's presented, first of all, as kind of this juvenile delinquent and this, evil, crazy, mad character that lives in the house. But in the end, he's the gentle, kind spirit that, as Atticus says, gives him back his children. He says, "Thank you for my children, Arthur." We see Mrs. DeBose, who's about as nasty and racist as it can be. Jem can't stand her. He cuts down all her camellias, all that, and again, more black and white images there with the camellias being a white flower. But yet she's brave enough to be able to kick the addiction, that she has this inner strength and this idea of a different kind of courage. We see Miss Caroline, the teacher, who makes tons of mistakes but is trying to do the right thing. Hecate, as we mentioned, who's trying to carry out the law but also understands when to bend it. So this idea that there are very few absolutes in the world becomes one of the common motifs or patterns that you see throughout the whole story. Courage and bravery is another motif that runs throughout the whole show. We see it at the very beginning where the children are daring each other. Are they brave enough to run up and touch Boo Radley's house? I'm going to touch the house there, to leave little things, to take the stuff out of the cubbyhole, into some very large things that people have to do that are very big on the courageous and brave scale. Atticus defending Tom Robinson, Scout confronting that angry mob at the jail that's about to lynch them, and instead she runs up and is able to turn them away. Miss DeBose, as we mentioned in the last slide, fighting the morphine addiction. Even Boo Radley being brave enough to come out to grab the knife and kill the Ewells, kill Bob Ewell in order to save Scout and Jem. So in the end, what is Harper Lee's final message on how to end racism and prejudice? The idea is that you end prejudice when you're able to have knowledge and compassion for people on an individual level. Not there's a black person, but there's my friend. Not there's one of those white ladies, but there's that person that I know and I understand who they are and where they come from and that they're good and bad just like me and that we have connections on an individual basis. You see this in a couple of big points in the story. The Scout is able to stop the angry mob just by going up to Walter Cunningham and reminding him that, hey, I'm going to school with your boy. Remember, we have this connection. Jem is able to make a different connection with Miss DuBose. And the kids are able to learn that Boo Radley is not this evil monster, but they learn something about his real nature, that he is also a mockingbird, something that just adds goodness and beauty to the world. So the final message we get really from Atticus with this idea that you never really get to know a person until you can walk around in their shoes, get inside of their skin, and see the world through their eyes.